So in the last bleeding video, I was rather unsure about the mechanic, and as it turns out, it's because the mechanic was bugged, more or less. Well, now that bleeding actually is something that is tangible and understandable, I'm going to explain it. And I have tried my best to avoid using debug menus. Well, they're not necessarily debug menus, but using variable menus to explain it. But I have no better way of explaining it, unfortunately. Otherwise I'd just be saying, bro, trust me, and I'm not doing that. So, let's make it very quick. You have 300 blood. If your blood drops below 270 blood, you start taking blood loss damage, which is at the top. Okay? So, let's just start a new experiment. Combat knife does 10 units of slash. And I'm not going to jump into super specific numbers, but slash weapons do more bleeding damage than blunt weapons. And they do slightly more bleed than pierce. So it goes slash, pierce, blunt in terms of how lethal it will be for bleeding. So a combat knife only does 10 damage of slash. This Urist has no armor, so I will do 10 slash damage. Now, I cut them with a knife, and that gives them a bleed amount of 2.5. Now, there's a 10% chance that it could crit, but I'm not going to jump into that either. I'm just going to explain bleeding. As you can see, they had a bleed amount of 2.5, and on the left, as it updates together, you can see the amount of blood they have dropping. Okay? And the bleed amount heals by 0.5 every 5 seconds. And as you can see, now that the bleed amount is now 0, so I'll stop that, so stop shaking. And look at that. Now that they're not bleeding, they are naturally recovering 0.3 blood every second, or every 5 seconds, because they are healthy. And healthy's in quotations, because I'm pretty sure the mechanic is quite literally called healthy. Well, that's a very simple example. Now let's cut them again. And we turn on auto refresh. I'm sorry, it shakes. Look at that, 2.5 bleed amount. Now, how you can figure this out in game is you shift click and you perform a basic examination. And look, he is bleeding. He's recovering his bleeding. He is still bleeding. Keep examining. We'll wait till 0.5. Even with 0.5, he is still bleeding. However, as soon as the blood amount hits 0, or the bleed amount hits 0, look at that. You're not bleeding. So you don't need these debug menus to understand that you're not bleeding anymore. So if you're not bleeding and you're not pale, you have not taken blood loss damage. Now let's jump into a little bit more of a brutal example. Say you get cut 4 times. Well, his bleed rate is now 9. He is in trouble. Look how fast his blood will drop. It is dangerous getting cut rapidly. So now, he's already at 262 blood and has a bleed amount of 8.5. That means, now that he has lost a lot of blood, and it will keep updating, I don't need to keep spamming this. So it will say he is bleeding, major gashes because of the slash damage, and is pale. Now that he is pale, if you examine them, you can see they are taking blood loss damage. And blood loss damage, it doesn't actually drain too fast, but it will become a lethal problem pretty quickly, especially since you probably already have taken a lot of damage if you're at this point of this much bleeding. However, what you can do to stop the bleeding is you take a tool like a cautery and turn on harm, and look at that. Bleed amount is 0, and they are no longer bleeding. Now, this is why you need tools like blood packs, which have been added to the game, and pills like iron to get this blood back. Because if you do not get their blood back to 270, which is, you can't see this in game, they will keep bleeding to death. So basically, you just shove blood packs down their throat, and look at that. It's up to 220, and iron is definitely your better method, but blood packs you spawn with, and in a pinch, will save your target. Your patient, not your target. But, see, they're still at 250 blood. They are still dying, so I gotta speed this up. But as soon as I cross the 270 threshold, which I'm about to do right now, this person is no longer pale because they are no longer taking blood loss damage. And I'm not going to explain medical work, but basically, heat damage, 1-to-1, will cauterize bleed amount. So if you take 5 heat damage, you will lose 5 bleed amount. If you get shot by a laser, after you just got cut up, they'll cauterize your wounds instantly. However, You most likely lost a lot of blood during that time, as you can even just see visually on the ground. There's a pretty big visual representation for losing blood, and that's even without moving. And you should just always check yourself, because anyone can examine themselves to see if they're bleeding. And if you have the pale modifier, you need iron or blood packs immediately. So a med visit is probably in your future. This is just a quick crash course, but I think this will explain bleeding. I think this explains bleeding in a way that's actually tangible. And no, you don't need any of these debug menus. Like I showed, you just need the examine health to understand your status of how bad you're dying. And of course, you need a health analyzer. And what's worth mentioning is once you're actually healthy again, blood loss on its own also recovers. So you aren't necessarily having to down Dex Plus or like just wrap yourself in gauze or whatever to heal your blood loss. So as long as you take care of the bleeding and the blood on its own, you will naturally recover. So use that for your med gameplay, use it for your own survival, and whatnot. If you have any further questions, probably just ask Whisper. Whisper is like the master of the bleed right now, but I can also probably help.